The rooftop of the reunion venue buzzed with old laughter and polished wine glasses clinking under fairy lights. Classmates surrounded Robert, a man once quiet and forgettable, now composed in a sleek charcoal suit with a calm presence that made others pause. A toast had just ended when someone called out teasingly, "So, Robert, when are you and Margaret finally tying the knot? It's been what, 10 years?" Robert smiled, reached into his coat pocket, and took out a stack of elegant wedding invitations. "The date is set," he said coolly, handing them out. "You're all invited." The laughter froze. Someone blinked. Another leaned in, squinting at the glossy photo on the invitation. Murmurs began to rise. Margaret, standing just a step behind him in a slim beige dress, forced a shaky laugh. "Robert, stop joking around." She snatched one of the invitations. Her smile died. The bride in the photo wasn't her. It was Melissa. Margaret's expression twisted instantly. She didn't ask questions. She didn't look for a microphone or a camera to see if this was some twisted prank. She reached for the nearest wine glass and dumped it over Robert's head, shards of ice and liquid splashing down his sharp jawline and tailored shirt. "You manipulative piece of trash," she hissed. "How dare you humiliate me like this, using tricks to pressure me into marriage?" Robert slowly wiped his face with a handkerchief. His voice was calm. "Margaret," he said, nodding at the invitation she'd just crushed in her fist. "Take a closer look. Is your name anywhere on that card?" Her fingers trembled, her painted nails scraped against the embossed lettering, then her eyes widened. The bride's name was Melissa, clear, bold, undeniable. All around them, former classmates whispered, "It's not her, it's someone else," someone mumbled. "Wait, is that Melissa from Class B? I thought it was Margaret, no wonder too." Her photo looked weird. Margaret staggered a step back, pale, then she lunged forward, trying to snatch the remaining invitations from Robert's hand. He moved back easily. She missed, lost her balance, and crashed into the corner of the dessert table, sending glass cups clattering and fruit skewers tumbling. Someone gasped, someone else laughed nervously. Robert didn't help her up. Once, he would have. Once, he would have apologized for breathing too loud or blinking at the wrong time. Now he simply stared. "You really think I planned all this to force you into marriage?" he said quietly. "You overestimate your importance. We broke up 6 months ago, or have you conveniently forgotten?" Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. Her eyes darted around the crowd. The silence was louder than anything. "You're lying," she hissed, voice cracking. "This is all some setup. You looped everyone into this mess to make me look bad." Robert's jaw tightened. "You think I forgot what I saw outside that hotel room? You and Daniel? You were wrapped around him like I never existed. You thought I'd still come crawling?" Margaret's confidence cracked like porcelain. She searched the crowd, but all she met were eyes filled with pity, or worse, amusement. A classmate finally spoke. "Robert, is this real? You and Margaret really?" "We've been over for half a year," Robert said, turning to them. "And Melissa is the woman I'm going to marry." From behind him, Margaret's voice rose again, shrill, desperate. "You're pathetic, Robert. I gave you 10 years, and you throw it away for some cheap second-choice girl who couldn't even win prom queen." Robert turned back toward her, voice razor-sharp. "You cheated on me, in front of my eyes, and you think I owe you something?" Margaret had no answer. Not really. She just stood there, mascara smudging, hands curled into fists, and for the first time in 10 years, Robert didn't feel the urge to reach out. He just felt free. He walked away. Robert's earliest memory of safety wasn't his parents' voices, it was the rough texture of a patched quilt and the quiet hum of Margaret's mother boiling congee at dawn. He had been 10 when a truck crushed both his parents on their way home. Relatives came to the funeral with long faces and shallow sympathy, all quick to list reasons why they couldn't take in another child. Margaret's mother, Aunt Ruth, stood silently at the edge. When everyone else had left, she was the one who gently pulled Robert into her arms and told him he'd be staying with them. Margaret had glared the entire car ride home. At first, Robert kept to himself. Margaret would toss his books off the table, slam the door to the shared bathroom, and throw fits when Aunt Ruth made him extra food. But Robert never retaliated. Slowly, after months, they settled into something that resembled family. When Robert turned 16, Aunt Ruth's health began to decline. The diagnosis was stomach cancer. Robert learned to cook in hospital cafeterias, used the library's computer to study food nutrition, and begged local vendors for part-time jobs just to buy her medicine. At home, he cleaned the kitchen, watched over Margaret, and stayed up nights sewing torn school uniforms. Aunt Ruth passed away before Robert turned 18. Before she slipped into her final coma, she held his hand and whispered, "Look after Margaret, she'll be alone after I'm gone." He promised. From that moment, guilt wove itself into every corner of his life. He stayed. Margaret changed after her mother died. She wasn't the wild teenager anymore. She became colder, sharper. At 20, she told Robert she wanted to try dating. "With you, I mean, since we already live together." Robert had never thought of her that way, but her voice trembled slightly when she asked, so he said yes. He thought it would bring her comfort. Instead, it gave her codes. Introl. By 23, Robert was juggling 2 jobs. He worked mornings at a bookstore and evenings delivering food. All his earnings went to their rent, her art supplies, her tuition, her cafe hobbies, her designer wish lists. Every evening he'd come home, put down his helmet and enter the kitchen. Margaret didn't like reheated food, so Robert learned to cook fast, fresh and flawless. He ironed her clothes, paid her phone bills, and when she forgot her own exhibition opening once, he stood in front of a crowd and made a speech about how she was probably sketching inspiration. He proposed the first time when he was 25. She laughed like he'd told a joke. "You, marriage? We can't even afford champagne." The second time, he proposed with a small ring he'd saved up for an entire year. She took a photo for social media, captioned it, "LOL, what even is this?" and never wore it again. But he stayed. At 28, he finally got promoted at work. It meant fewer delivery runs, more nights at home, and for a while, things got better. Margaret started acting sweet again. Robert mistook this for love. Until the hotel incident 6 months ago shattered everything, but long before that moment, years before Robert ever knew what betrayal tasted like, someone else had quietly been watching him. Melissa. They were never close in high school. She was quiet, pretty in a way that didn't try, and always surrounded by whispers. Boys liked her, girls envied her, and teachers loved her grades. But what people didn't see were the bruises left by silent bullying, the insults slipped into her locker, the laughter in the bathroom stalls. One evening, after a study session went late, Melissa missed the last group walk home. As she took the shortcut near the back of the school, a group of girls blocked her path. "Think you're better than us?" one said. Another yanked her bag. A third pulled at her collar, threatening to tear her blouse. Melissa panicked, and then a quiet voice called out, "Let her go." It was Robert. He wasn't tall back then, just lanky, pale from too much part-time work, with calloused hands and tired eyes, but he stood his ground. "Touch her again, and I'll report every one of you. I already know your names." The girls muttered insults but backed off. Melissa stood frozen. Robert picked up her bag, dusted it off, and handed it to her. "Do you live nearby?" he asked. She nodded, voice too shaky to speak. They walked in silence. Robert never asked for thanks, never made a big deal, just said, "Stay safe," and took the longer way home afterward. But to Melissa, that night meant everything. She never forgot the boy who stood up for her without asking anything in return. After that, she began watching him, not like a crush, but like a quiet study of someone who moved through life with invisible weights. She noticed how he always stood at the back of the class, how he skipped lunch but bought others snacks, how he never spoke unless spoken to. And when she heard years later that Robert and Margaret were still living together, she assumed they were truly in love. She was wrong. They crossed paths again during a charity auction. Melissa was there helping organize the event. Robert arrived late, flustered, in a wrinkled shirt, apologizing for missing most of it because Margaret had refused to come. Melissa offered him coffee. They spoke. He remembered her. She remembered everything. From that moment, Robert noticed something different about her, something stable, warm, undemanding. Melissa didn't ask him to perform. She listened. She laughed quietly at his dry jokes. And unlike Margaret, she never once told him he was too much, or too little. Over the next few months, their lives overlapped more. He helped her fix a leaking pipe in her apartment. She helped him format a proposal late at night. Eventually, it became routine. She'd text to ask if he'd eaten. He'd check and when her insomnia flared, it was the kind of quiet care Robert had never experienced. He didn't realize how deeply it had affected him until the day he saw Margaret in Daniel's arms and felt nothing. That night, he messaged Melissa. "Can we talk?" She replied immediately, "Always." That one word felt like air after drowning. And so, without any ceremony, a new chapter began. Not loud, not public, just two quiet people finally finding each other in the aftermath of storm after storm. Neither of them knew it then, but that smallest kindness in high school had just come full circle. 6 months ago, Robert didn't scream, he didn't demand an explanation, he didn't even knock. He just stood there, frozen outside the hotel room door, watching through the narrow opening as Margaret leaned into Daniel's chest, laughing in a way Robert hadn't heard in years. Her fingers were on the buttons of Daniel's shirt. Daniel's hands were already tracing her waist. Robert remembered how they didn't even notice him standing there. The moment they closed the door, Robert turned and walked away. No words, no scene, no begging. That night, he packed a single suitcase and moved out of Margaret's apartment. She didn't call, she didn't message, not even once. He'd half expected her to chase after him with some lie, some sob story, some apology rehearsed like a script, but she didn't, because she was certain, like always, that he would return on his knees, arms full of groceries and regret. She underestimated just how empty he'd become. In the months that followed, Robert rebuilt his life in silence. He focused on his new position at work, bought a small condo, cooked for one, slept alone, and slowly, something unfamiliar crept in: peace. Melissa had entered his world during that fragile transition, offering not pity, but presence. They started slow. Dinner turned into conversation, conversation turned into comfort, comfort turned into mornings that didn't feel heavy. For the first time, Robert tasted what love without debt felt like. Then came the reunion, a rooftop full of memories, familiar faces, too much wine. And Margaret. She wore a white cocktail dress, her hair curled, her lips glossed to perfection. She made her entrance like she always did, fashionably late, theatrically admired. People smiled, old friends laughed, and she stood beside Robert like she still belonged there. Until Robert handed out the invitations. Until she saw Melissa's face in the glossy photo beside his. That was the moment her world cracked. "You're manipulating me," Margaret screamed, flinging her wine at him. "You brought that woman here to humiliate me." People gasped. Phones lowered. Conversations froze. Robert didn't flinch. He dabbed his cheek with a napkin and held up the invitation. "Margaret, read the name. It's not yours. It never was." Margaret's eyes darted to the card, to the unfamiliar cursive, Melissa. For a brief moment, she faltered, but pride surged in again, like poison. "So that's it?" she spat. "You downgrade to some backup girl and expect everyone to clap?" Robert remained still. "We broke up 6 months ago. You're just in denial." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "You're lying. We were never broken up. You left because of some childish tantrum." "I left because I saw you with Daniel." Her silence betrayed her for half a second, then the performance resumed. "Oh, so you're going to drag my name just to justify your affair?" she said, loud enough for others to hear. "Fine, let's make it a show." Melissa stepped forward, trying to de-escalate. "Margaret, this isn't necessary." Margaret turned on her like a blade. "Shut up. You've been after him for years, haven't you? Always hovering, always waiting for a crack. Well, congrats, you got your opening." Robert placed himself between them. Enough. But it wasn't enough. That night, Margaret left without another word. But within 48 hours, the online war began. The first post showed a blurry clip of Robert holding Melissa's hand on the rooftop. The caption read, "10 years of love thrown away. He cheated on me with her and announced it at our reunion." Hashtags exploded. Sympathy rolled in. Then came an old photo, Margaret in a hospital bed, Robert by her side, feeding her soup. He said he'd protect me for life. Turns out life meant until someone prettier smiled. Then a video, edited clips of Robert raising his voice at Margaret, spliced with clips of Melissa laughing. The narrative was clear. Robert was a manipulator, Melissa, a homewrecker, Margaret, a victim. Melissa found out on a Monday morning. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through comment sections. Gold digger, wrecked a 10-year relationship. She must be good in bed, huh? Robert didn't need to ask who was behind it. Only Margaret could be this venomous. Only she would weaponize public perception like this. When he called her, she didn't answer, but hours later, a message came through. Delete your engagement post or I'll leak worse. You don't get to live happily ever after while I'm left humiliated. Robert read the message 3 times, then once more. That night, he held Melissa's hand tightly. I'm sorry, she whispered. This is my fault. If I hadn't. No, he said. This started long before you came back into my life. He filed a report with the platform, reached out to his legal team. But Margaret was clever. Everything was twisted just enough to be technically opinion. She knew how to tiptoe along the edge of slander. Melissa stopped going out. She deleted her profiles. She told Robert she was fine, but her eyes lost their glow. She was slipping into shadows she hadn't visited in years. And still, Margaret posted. Still, she pretended she was the one left bleeding. Robert wanted to scream, but more than anything, he wanted to protect Melissa. He spent 10 years enduring Margaret's manipulations. He would not let the next 10 be defined by her cruelty. The next morning, he walked into a media firm with a thick folder of evidence. She wants a war, he said quietly. I'll give her one. He wasn't the same man who used to kneel. He was the man standing now, and he wasn't stepping back. The worst part wasn't the online comments, it was Melissa's silence. In the days after Margaret leaked the cemetery footage, Melissa didn't speak much. She moved slower, she stopped humming while washing dishes, and she flinched whenever her phone lit up, even if it was just a weather alert. The video Margaret posted was calculated cruelty. It showed Robert and Melissa at his foster mother's grave. The caption read, "Adultery knows no boundaries, not even the dead are spared." The clip had been edited so masterfully that strangers truly believed Melissa had pranced into sacred ground just to rub her win in Margaret's face. They didn't see the moments before, the tears in Melissa's eyes, the way she stood back respectfully, waiting for Robert to finish kneeling. They only saw what Margaret wanted them to see. The hate messages poured in. Melissa's face, once hidden in peaceful obscurity, was now a meme for betrayal. Her workplace began receiving anonymous complaints. Her name trended for all the wrong reasons. Robert tried everything. He had lawyers draft takedown notices. He hired a private PR firm to counter the lies, but Margaret was relentless, adapting her attacks, using throwaway accounts and ghost editors to stay a step ahead. One night, Robert came home and found Melissa sitting on the kitchen floor, her back against the fridge. Her arms were wrapped tightly around her knees, her eyes vacant. He dropped everything and knelt beside her. "Melissa," he said softly. She didn't look at him. Her voice was a whisper. "It's happening again." Robert didn't ask what she meant. He already knew. "They're saying I deserve to die," she said, her lip trembling. "That I'm a slut, a homewrecker, a disease. You're none of those things. They don't care." She finally turned to him. Her eyes were red, her voice cracked. "Do you know how hard I worked to survive high school, to stop crying in bathrooms, to eat without hearing whispers?" Robert's throat tightened. "I know." "No, you don't," she said. "Back then, when you saved me from those girls behind the gym, I thought the nightmare would end, but it got worse. They made up stories, spread pictures they photoshopped, and the person who started it all was Margaret." The room fell silent. Robert froze. Melissa continued, almost in a trance. "She hated me, said I was trying to take her place, that I was pretty on purpose. She told the girls that I flirted with teachers, that I faked crying for sympathy. She was the one who invited them to that alley behind the gym that night." Robert sat back, stunned. "She orchestrated it?" Melissa nodded. "She stayed hidden while they mocked me, laughed when I begged them to stop. When you showed up, she ran. I saw her reflection in the glass. I've never told anyone." He closed his eyes. It all made sense now. The way Margaret treated Melissa like an enemy from the start. The venom in her voice, the way she targeted her with surgical precision, even now. This wasn't random jealousy. This was a decade of obsession and hatred buried under Margaret's carefully maintained image. Robert's shame hit him like a freight train. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I brought you back into her orbit." Melissa shook her head. "You didn't know." "But I should have. I should have seen it sooner. She didn't just manipulate me. She's been trying to erase you from the beginning." Melissa's lips quivered. "I'm scared, Robert." He pulled her into his arms. She was trembling. "I won't let the past destroy you again," he whispered into her hair. "Not this time. Not ever." That night, he sat beside her until she fell asleep on the couch. He didn't move. He watched her chest rise and fall, her fingers twitch against his palm. He thought about the 10 years he spent with Margaret, how he had been blind, apologizing for sins he never committed, trying to love someone who only saw him as a tool. And now, here was Melissa, gentle, scarred, resilient, and she was unraveling because Margaret wouldn't let the past die. His guilt turned into a slow-burning rage. Not loud, not theatrical, not like Margaret's public tantrums. It was quiet, focused. The kind of fury that didn't fade until it carved justice. The next morning, Robert began collecting every shred of Margaret's past he could find. Old texts, financial records, anonymous usernames, witnesses. He called a private investigator. If Margaret wanted a war, he would fight one, but not with fists, with facts. And this time, it wouldn't be to save himself, it would be to protect the woman who once found light in a 10-minute walk home, and had been fighting off shadows ever since. This time, he'd be her light, and no one, not even Margaret, would ever dim it again. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. Robert had just finished making lunch. Melissa sat on the couch folding laundry, her face more at ease than it had been in weeks. The apartment smelled of basil and garlic. There was peace. Until the door slammed open. Margaret stood there like a storm in heels, hair wild, cheeks flushed with fury. Her eyes locked onto Melissa like a wolf scenting blood. Robert stood instantly. "What are you doing here?" Margaret didn't answer him. Her attention was entirely fixed on Melissa. "So this is your little slut den," she said, her voice dripping venom. "You really traded me for this?" Melissa's shoulders stiffened. "Get out," Robert snapped. But Margaret was already walking further in, her heels tapping against the hardwood like hammers. "I'm not going anywhere, not until I've said everything I need to." Robert stepped in front of Melissa, shielding her. Margaret scoffed. "Still playing the hero? What, you think that makes you noble? Please, you're pathetic, and you," she turned to Melissa, "you're garbage, a nobody, a whore who clung to the first man who threw you a scrap." Melissa didn't flinch, but her eyes turned glassy. 10 years, Robert," Margaret said, circling like a viper. 10 years I gave you. You were a stray, a burden, and I made you someone. I took you from gutter to gallery, and this is how you thank me?" Robert's fists clenched. "I carried your dead foster mother like she was my own, but even she knew what a parasite you were." Something inside Robert snapped. He lunged. His hand wrapped around Margaret's throat before he even registered the motion. She gasped, nails clawing at his wrist, eyes bulging. He slammed her against the wall, his other hand pinning her shoulder. "Don't you dare say her name," he growled, breath ragged. "You don't get to use her, not after everything." Margaret choked, her heels scraping against the floor. "Let me. You insulted the only person who ever gave me a home. You mocked the woman who died asking me to protect you. You trampled on her memory like you trampled on everything good in your life." "Robert, stop!" Melissa's voice broke behind him, desperate. "She's not worth it," Melissa cried, rushing over. Her hands gripped his arm. "I need you to stay kind. Please, don't let her break what's good in you." His fingers were white around Margaret's throat. Melissa's tears soaked his sleeve. Slowly, Robert's grip loosened. Margaret fell to the floor, gasping and coughing, mascara streaking her cheeks in wet black lines. She scrambled up, clutching her neck, glaring at them both with wild disbelief. "You'll regret this," she spat. "I'll destroy you." "Try," Robert said coldly, "and I'll make sure you never stand again." She stumbled out, slamming the door behind her. Melissa turned to Robert, her hands still trembling. "I was so scared," she whispered. "I thought I'd lose you to anger." "You'll never lose me," he said, his voice still shaking. "But I came so close to doing something I can't take back." Melissa nodded. "That's why I stopped you, because we fight different than she does." But Margaret didn't waste time. 2 days later, a tearful video surfaced online. Margaret sat on a couch with a bruised makeup pattern on her neck, sniffling. "I don't want to talk about it," she whispered, voice trembling, "but Robert choked me, in front of his mistress, in front of my mother's memory." The video exploded. Headlines screamed, "CEO attacks ex-girlfriend over new fiancé." Clips replayed. Pity poured in. Sympathy hashtags trended. But Robert had been ready. He didn't release a statement. He released proof. Screenshots of threatening messages from Margaret. Security footage from the building entrance showing Margaret forcing her way in uninvited. audio recordings from a smart assistant that caught her insults word for word, including every slur, every threat, every desecration of his foster mother's name. Then came the real blow. Robert filed a lawsuit against Margaret for defamation, unlawful entry, and harassment. But he didn't stop there. He had partnered with a powerful media company known for uncovering corruption. With their help, he leaked evidence of Margaret's affair with Daniel during their relationship, including financial transactions showing she funneled joint savings into Daniel's failing business. The report included screenshots of Margaret mocking Melissa in private chats, coordinating online trolls, and intentionally editing cemetery footage to mislead the public. And then, in the final segment, came the revelation that shattered what little public sympathy Margaret had left. She had used fake non-profit accounts to funnel sponsorship funds during her last gallery exhibition, donations meant for women's shelters that never made it past her bank account. The narrative flipped in a matter of hours. Margaret was no longer the victim. She was the abuser, the liar, the thief. Melissa's name began trending too, but now with words like brave, resilient, wrongfully accused. Robert didn't celebrate, he didn't smile. He simply walked into the living room, where Melissa sat reading quietly, and gently handed her the news. She read the headline once. Then again. Her hands trembled slightly. "You did this for me?" she asked softly. "For us," he said. A single tear slid down her cheek. "She tried to break me again. She won't get another chance." Melissa nodded, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. "Then let's stop looking back." Robert nodded too. Because from this point forward, the only direction left was forward. Together. The courtroom was cold, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but the hallway outside buzzed with reporters. Everyone wanted a piece of the story. The once private unraveling of Robert and Margaret's decade-long relationship had become a public theater: scandal, betrayal, abuse, fraud, and now, the world was watching its final act. Robert sat at the plaintiff's table, dressed in a simple navy suit. Beside him, Melissa held a small notepad in her lap, her fingers resting gently over it. She hadn't looked up once since they entered, the weight of months, of lies, harassment, slander, pressed down on her shoulders, but her presence remained calm, resolute. Across the room, Margaret sat flanked by her defense team, her makeup muted, eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses. Next to her, Daniel sat rigid, lips pursed, avoiding her gaze entirely. The judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp gray eyes, called for order. Robert stood. He didn't gesture, he didn't raise his voice, he simply opened a folder and began to speak. "Your Honor," he said evenly, "this case began with claims of emotional and physical abuse. Accusations that I harmed my former partner and manipulated a young woman into an affair. For weeks, I remained silent, not because the claims were true, but because I knew the truth was bigger than just slander." He held up a stack of printed invoices. "These are falsified donation records submitted by Margaret and Daniel through a charity art fundraiser last spring. The fundraiser, titled Colors of Hope, claimed to raise funds for a cancer treatment nonprofit. Public donations exceeded $2.1 million. The courtroom murmured. These invoices, dozens of them, are for fabricated expenses, fake suppliers, ghost artists, printing services that never existed. All of them lead to shell companies registered under Daniel's name." The defense lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor, these claims have not been." "They have," Robert interrupted. "The nonprofit filed a joint investigation with the city's financial crimes unit 2 months ago. Here are their findings." He handed a binder to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. Margaret shifted in her seat. Daniel stiffened, his eyes finally moving, for the first time that morning, to the documents. "Witnesses have come forward," Robert continued, "former assistants, gallery interns, and even a printing company owner who was approached to fake invoices in exchange for a cut. They declined. They also submitted this affidavit." The judge skimmed the contents, her expression darkening. "Your Honor," Robert said, voice steady, "the same woman who sat in this courtroom and claimed to be a victim of emotional abuse was, in fact, using public sympathy to cover a large-scale financial fraud scheme, with Daniel as her partner." Margaret's lawyer stood again, this time only to request a recess. The judge denied it. Then she turned to the defense table. "Ms. Reeves," she said to Margaret, "do you wish to respond?" Margaret finally removed her glasses. For the first time, her eyes weren't defiant, they were calculating, darting between the judge, the cameras outside the courtroom doors, and Daniel beside her. Her lips parted, as if she were about to say something smart, something that could twist the room. But Daniel spoke first. "I had no idea the accounts were fake," he said quickly. "It was all her, I only did what I was told." Margaret turned to him, stunned. "You're joking." Daniel looked away. Robert watched in silence as the betrayal unfolded. "You coward," Margaret hissed. "You signed every form. You used your own company. You knew." "Enough," the judge snapped. "Save it for sentencing." A prosecutor stepped forward to verify Robert's evidence. The testimony, the fraud reports, the emails, it was airtight. And in the middle of it all, Melissa sat still. She hadn't spoken, hadn't reacted, not even when her name was mentioned again and again. Because this wasn't her trial, it was her vindication. The court allowed Robert to read one final statement. He looked directly at Margaret as he began. "For months, I was painted as an abuser, a manipulator. For months, Melissa was called a homewrecker, a liar, a parasite. But the truth is, she's the only person in my life who ever showed me what respect feels like. While Margaret used my past as a leash, Melissa gave me space to grow. While Margaret screamed, Melissa listened. While Margaret schemed, Melissa healed." He paused. "I stayed silent for 10 years, out of guilt, out of obligation, out of a deathbed promise, but today, I speak not out of anger, but because I refuse to let that silence become complicity." He looked at the judge. "I'm done being used." The courtroom was quiet. The judge reviewed the documents again, then delivered her decision. "Margaret Reeves and Daniel Chen, this court finds sufficient evidence to proceed with formal charges of charitable fraud, misappropriation of public funds, and online defamation. The state will also pursue separate charges based on financial documentation provided. Effective immediately, both defendants are remanded into custody pending sentencing." Gasps echoed through the room. Margaret's hands slammed the table. "You can't do this to me. I was his everything. I raised him. I gave him 10 years. The judge didn't flinch. 2 officers approached. Margaret turned toward Robert, wild-eyed. "You still owe me," she shouted. "For my mother, for everything she did for you. You wouldn't even exist without us." Robert stood as they cuffed her wrists. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. He just stepped forward and said quietly, so only she could hear. "I've already repaid my debt, with 10 years of silence." Margaret froze. Her lips trembled. Then she laughed, an empty, bitter sound, as they pulled her away. Daniel tried to go back. To avoid eye contact with everyone as he was escorted out next. There was no loyalty left between them, no alliance, just 2 people drowning in a fire they built together. When the courtroom cleared, Robert turned to Melissa. She hadn't moved. "Hey," he said softly. She looked up, eyes brimming. "It's over," he whispered. She nodded, a single tear falling. "I never thought the truth would win." "It did. You did." He reached for her hand. She took it. Outside the courtroom, the press surged forward, flashes exploded, microphones pushed toward them. But Robert didn't stop to speak. He kept walking. Melissa beside him. Their fingers intertwined. And for the first time in years, every step forward felt like it finally belonged to him. Sunlight spilled into the kitchen like a warm breath of forgiveness. The past no longer lived in the corners of Robert's mind like a haunting whisper. It had been exorcised in court, in truth, and in time. Melissa stood by the window, sleeves rolled up, a splash of yellow paint on her cheek. Her canvas leaned against the wall, half finished but already alive. Blue irises bloomed across the surface, soft and brilliant. She hadn't painted since high school, not since the bullying, not since Margaret. Now, every brushstroke was a rebellion, a quiet reclaiming of something that had once been stolen from her. Robert walked up behind her and kissed her temple. "You've got it all over your face." "Good," she said. "Then I'm doing it right." He chuckled and turned back to the stove, flipping the eggs. It had become a ritual, her painting, his cooking, music drifting through the apartment, and no eyes watching but each other's. Their wedding had been quiet, no sponsors, no live streams, no press, just close friends, a lakeside view, and vows spoken like promises whispered under a blanket. Melissa wore a simple satin dress. Robert wore his foster mother's pendant tucked beneath his shirt. They didn't pose for followers, they danced in bare feet, lit sparklers with laughter, and ended the night holding hands under a starry sky. It was everything they needed, nothing more. 3 months later, Melissa stood in the hallway of their home holding a white stick with trembling hands. Robert was in the kitchen, drying dishes when he heard her call. She didn't say his name like a panic, she said it like a question, like hope wrapped in disbelief. He turned, saw her frozen in place, saw the test in her fingers, saw the emotion fighting its way across her face. He walked over slowly. Melissa looked at him, eyes brimming. "Robert." His hand found her belly before either of them said another word. "You're pregnant?" She nodded, and he pulled her into a hug so tight the test almost dropped. "We're having a baby?" Melissa buried her face in his neck. "We're having a baby." They stood like that for a long time. The dishes remained half-dried, the music in the background faded to silence, nothing else mattered. Later that night, they stood in the kitchen, her back against his chest, his hand resting over her stomach. "I'll make sure this child never feels unloved," Robert whispered. Melissa reached up and tangled her fingers through his. "They'll grow up with music and art and warmth, not fear, not shame. I won't let them carry what we had to survive." She turned her head slightly. "Do you still think about it, her?" "Sometimes," he said honestly. "But not with anger, just closure." Melissa exhaled softly, her breath fogging the window. Outside, the city glittered. Not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that reminded you life goes on. The TV hummed faintly from the living room. News footage played muted, but the visuals were unmistakable. Margaret in handcuffs. Daniel, beside her, head down. The screen showed old footage of their gallery fundraiser, then cut to reports of their sentencing, 3 years in prison, full financial restitution, barred from handling charitable funds for life. Their faces were drawn, their clothes plain. The masks they wore in public, wealth, charisma, control, had all been stripped away. Robert stared at the screen for a second, then turned it off. Melissa watched him. "Does it feel good?" "No," he said. "It doesn't feel good." She nodded slowly. "It feels right," he added. That was the difference. It wasn't revenge, it was balance. The world had seen the truth, and now he could finally let go of the anger without guilt. Melissa walked over and wrapped her arms around him from behind. "You didn't just free me, Robert," she whispered. "You freed yourself." He reached for her hands and kissed her knuckles. "You know what you are to me?" she asked. He smiled. "Beautiful. Besides that." He turned to face her. "What?" Melissa looked into his eyes, voice soft. "We're not just each other's sugar." He raised an eyebrow. "No?" She shook her head, the corners of her lips curving upward. "We're each other's medicine." Robert laughed, genuine, from the chest. "That sounds like a line from your paintings." "I'm serious," she said. "You were the first person who ever protected me, and I was the first person who ever saw you." "I always felt invisible," he murmured. "Even when I was giving everything I had to someone else." "You're not invisible anymore." They held each other for a long time, her cheek pressed against his chest, his hand resting on the small life beginning inside her. Later that week, Melissa returned to her art studio and for the first time since high school, submitted work to an open exhibition. Her paintings, raw and elegant, titled Recovery, were accepted immediately. The gallery described them as intimate portraits of invisible healing. Meanwhile, Robert finalized the company's IPO. Investors praised his calm under pressure, unaware that his greatest victory wasn't on spreadsheets, it was the quiet joy of coming home to someone who didn't require him to sacrifice his soul to earn love. Peace, he realized, wasn't the absence of conflict, it was the presence of someone who holds your hand while you heal. And in Melissa, he had found that peace. The past didn't vanish, but it stopped roaring. It stopped defining him. He looked at the woman across the kitchen table, barefoot, glowing, laughing softly at something on her phone. He looked at her and saw future. Not just his, but theirs. And for the first time in his life, Robert knew, with absolute certainty, that love, when real, doesn't burn you alive. It lights the way home.